Well, let me do a quick introduction of Daryl then, and I'll let him take over. And if we could share those results momentarily, and while Daryl's doing his presentation, I'll do some damage control on that and have it sorted for next time. So our first presentation is going to be with Daryl. He is our Executive Technical Service Director at EstesGroup and leads our technical team. He has over 35 years of IT experience in both cybersecurity, along with network, server, and database admin. He works to build and maintain the server architectures that serve as the foundation of our Echo managed hosting platform. And he will be talking to you today about some server best practices as they relate to a P21 ecosystem. And with that, here is Daryl.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Cindy. Appreciate that. Hopefully y'all can hear me. If you can't hear me, let me know. Raise a hand or something like that. I'll go through. And I have lots of good stuff to share. So good morning, all. Welcome to the I would call it the most technical part of the conversation here today, because I'm more on the infrastructure side. My official title is Director of Technology Services here at the EstesGroup, and I deal with speeds and feeds and servers and bits and bytes and those kinds of things. And I thought I would bring to you the benefit of my 35 years of expertise in managing Windows servers as it relates to P21. So what I'd like to do here is start death by PowerPoint. Actually, no, I'm just kidding. I really don't like to do death by PowerPoint. I have a lot of good information. I want to share it with you. Again, we are sharing this presentation afterwards. So if you want to grab your notebook and start taking notes, that might be helpful. I don't have all of the information here in this slide deck, but let's go ahead and share it out here. So with that in mind, you all should now see my best practices for your P21 servers. Yes? Okay, well, great. Let's go move forward then. I don't see anybody saying no, so I think that's perfect. Okay, so lots of good stuff here. So first thing I want to talk about is at the very high level, I need to talk about some of the things that are going to make your life easier as you continue your P21 journey. We're going to talk about servers, which is certainly the primary part of my conversation. Wanted to also discuss infrastructure, right? Servers are great, but they're not isolatable boxes. You have to connect them together, and the infrastructure is the wiring, so to speak, to put that in. The application itself, not within the P21 application, because we've got Jim and Terry here on the webinar today that are much more experienced than I am within the application. However, your application P21 lives as a SQL server and a middleware server and maybe terminal servers and all sorts of good stuff. And those applications are something that we want to make sure that you have a clear understanding on how to best manage those support of the P21 client. I did want to mention change management, always a challenge, certainly as we go through with the rapid changes we're seeing in the P21 space, as well as, Windows keeps updating their stuff and things like that. Change management is a key part of any ERP system. And then I did want to talk a little bit about server location, and that is where do you have your options of putting all of these servers that we're about to talk about, and some of the pros and cons about where those servers might be. If at any point you have any questions, you are free to post in the Q&A session. If I look over this way, it's not because I'm ignoring you, it's because I'm looking at the Q&A tab. And I'll certainly leave time at the end of my presentation for a more boisterous conversation, as it were, about my topic. Okay, so servers, first off, when we look at a server environment, we have a couple of different architectures that we look at. First, most ERP solutions run in a 3-tiered model at this point. Now, for those 50% of you that are still running the legacy or the fat client, as opposed to the 30% running the web client and the 40% running the hybrid client, most ERP solutions run in this 3-tiered model where we've got the SQL database living on one box, physical or virtual. We've got the application server, often called the middleware server in P21 lingo, living as another box, and then the user interface. And that user interface, whether it's the old legacy client, whether it's the legacy client installed in an RDP farm, whether it's the browser, or a variety of different ways. There's lots of different user interfaces to P21. But those 3 different levels are typically what any modern solution is laid out in. So depending on the size and the volume of transactions and the availability that you need, you might have a couple of different ways that you configure these three-tiered models. Now, keep in mind that the old legacy P21 was set up as a two-tiered model. That is, there was a SQL server and all the little users connected to that via the legacy client. So therefore, in that original environment, it was just a two-tiered model. As we move into the newer flavor, we definitely have the three-tiered model. So you could have put that database and middleware application on a single OS. However, that's not recommended. It gives the machine a split personality. So Epicor has clearly recommended, note, your SQL server and your middleware server needs to be two separate boxes. They could be two separate virtual machines on the same physical hardware, but we need to take a look at some of that, and we'll talk about that later. You probably have them separated as three separate servers, okay, or three separate environments. We have a SQL server, we have a middleware server, and then you have all your user interface, whether it's installed on the local workstation or it's deployed via an RDP farm, is up to you and the type of client that you're using. For the purists out there, I understand that there are some companies that go, we never do anything in production without first doing it in test. If you have three servers in production, well, then by definition, in that purist attitude, you've got to have three other servers for test, okay? Which is fine, and I love that because it completely separates production from test. So you can reboot the test server, you can change the test server share permissions, you can change the test server SQL version, and it doesn't impact production. So you know exactly what's going on in test before you do it in production. However, maintaining those 6 different servers for some companies might be a challenge. And so therefore we see some common combinations. Like for example, it is not unusual in the P21 space to have a common SQL server. As you might know, SQL is licensed typically in what they call a per processor or per core mode. Every 4 cores that you present to a SQL server, Microsoft makes a little bit, or if you have Enterprise Edition, a lot of money. And by being able to combine the test environment, the production environment into the same SQL server, you can save a whole lot in licensing costs. I have seen where we have separate instances for production and another instance for test, somewhat differentiating those 2 environments, even on the same physical box. Additional instances don't cost any more Microsoft licensing. So that's kind of a handy thing. You could use a common RDP farm. If you're using an RDP farm, it's real easy to install 2 P21 clients, one for production, one for test. In fact, a lot of you probably have 1 P21 client with 2 profiles, one for production and one for test. And that's great as long as you're running the same version of P21 in production and test. But if you're testing an upgrade to the latest version of P21, there's probably a corresponding client upgrade. So you might have 2 separate clients, 2 separate locations on the file system for those 2 clients to, again, split test and production. You could have a common application server. And this is something where you basically have one middleware server and it's got a live install and a test install. And we have a lot of clients that have 3, 4, 5 different applications installed on that one application server. However, there is a challenge there in that it's easy to, I call it cross-contaminate reports and other common folders. If your test environment uses the same folder structure as your production environment, then it can be a little confusing as to what crystal report you're testing, right? If you upgraded it to crystal report and it's called the same thing in production and test, and they're both in a common folder, as soon as you upgrade that report, you've done it for both test and production. So again, it's easy kind of cross-contaminate those reports as long as you have a clear idea of what your report names are and your folder structures are. You can get around that. And that's typically what we see is we have one application server with multiple installs. The smaller companies tend to combine these roles together. The larger companies that have the resources, both in terms of physical machines, licensing, as well as manpower, to be able to support 6 different servers. The larger companies do split them apart because they see the benefit of having an isolated test environment, completely independent from the production environment. So it's kind of important to realize this because as we build our server architecture, how you combine these things together is going to play out in how you tune and tweak and optimize the systems. So I would like to go forward here and talk a little bit then about this wonderful thing that Epicor is doing to us, or has done to us. This isn't really new, right? Looking at the poll results, 30% of you are running the web client, and 40% are running the hybrid client, and 50% are running the legacy client, which adds up to more than 100%. That's a good thing because you can actually run them simultaneously. So I just wanted to point out here, what I call the legacy P21 client is actually in Epicor speak called the desktop application. Then there's the web client and or the hybrid client. And these are the newer flavors that Epicor is actively upgrading and adding features to. But I want to talk a little bit more about each of these different clients and what the roles and what load they place on your servers. So when you look at the legacy client, you're typically going to install this directly on the PC, or you're going to install it on an RDP farm. RDP is our remote desktop farm, right? And I say scaled out because if you have a small legacy client deployment with, say, 10 users or less, 15 users or less, you can probably get away with a single RDP server. But if you have more than that 15 user-ish limit, depending on how heavy users they are, you'll find yourself maxing out the resources of any one terminal server or RDP server. And so what you'll need is just to add another RDP server. For example, we have a client that has 150 legacy clients deployed in an RDP farm. They have 17 RDP servers to comfortably support their 150 users. So if you got enough resources to hold 17 RDP servers, like 12 CPUs, 16 gigs of RAM each, great, but that's a significant investment in an RDP farm. The legacy client does communicate directly to SQL. So it's going to talk directly to your SQL server. So if you got the legacy client installed on your desktop or your workstation, know that it's going to be chatting to the SQL server, and you really want a close, high performance connection between your client and that SQL server. In the case of the RDP farm, it's that RDP farm that's talking to the SQL server. The clients are just talking over RDP protocols. And there's some benefits there. We'll talk about that a little bit. The legacy client, of course, has been the traditional client that's been out there for a bazillion years, since long before I got into P21. And that's where you have all your typical or traditional customizations that have gone on in times gone past, right? The Dynachange rules, third-party app development. Some third-party app development did actually piggyback on top of the middleware server. And in that case, in the legacy environment, the middleware server was simply used for maybe your e-commerce application or e-commerce connectivity. Maybe it was only used to support certain third-party programming because people realized that middleware server was a much better programming endpoint than just trying to start modifying the P21 client directly. However, it is important to note that the version 2021.1 is the last legacy client that Epicor is going to give us. And in fact, after November 30th of next year, even that's not going to get any more fixes. So we have here kind of a drop dead date of the end of next year before the legacy client, while it will still run, it's not going to break just magically after November 30th. So just like Windows 7 continues to run, right? And heaven forbid, if I asked anybody who's still running Windows XP, I would hope no hands go up, but I still see some XP out there. It doesn't break, it just becomes less secure. You don't get the fixes. And so if you have a problem with the P21 legacy client, Epicor is going to be more and more reticent to help you out with that. And we can share a much more detailed article. It's up on Epicor's, the ERP customer website, as to exactly the timeframes on these support models are going to play out. So the legacy client, it's the old standby. However, as we move forward, obviously with the 11/30/22 drop dead dates, the web client is going to be the way to go. Now, the web client is actually two different flavors. You can run the web client in any modern browser, or you can run the hybrid client. And the hybrid client is a Windows or a Mac OS for you Mac users install that you can put on the desktop. And it's just a thin little shim. It auto updates, which is nice. So that way you can push the hybrid client out. presents a more familiar Windows interface for the end user, even though it is a very different interface from the legacy client. The web client and the hybrid client are a whole lot lighter and easier to deal with from a communication perspective. They communicate with your middleware server. They never talk directly to the SQL server. So when they're communicating with the middleware server, as we'll see in a later slide, they've got some benefits in terms of the protocols used. Of course, the support from the developers and Epicor is where all the attention is going. So if you see new features, for example, there's a new web report tool that's available in the web/hybrid client, both of them, that isn't there in the legacy client. So if you're looking to do web reports and you've written your own custom Crystal reports, or you have a third-party tool to do reporting, you might want to look at this new web client tool for the web reporting, and that might make your life easier as you go down the road. So lots of different ways that we can identify the differences between the two clients. There's a great document from Epicor that talks about what are some of the key differences in the web client from the legacy. If you're interested in that, please message me afterwards. I'll make sure that I get that document over to you. Okay, so coming back now to our server best practices. Of course, the server itself is going to be where all your users make it or break it. The hardware resources that you apply to that server are going to determine its overall performance, right? Every server and workstation, for that matter, has four main components: the number of processors, the amount of disk and the speed of the disk, the network pipe that you connect to it, and the amount of RAM or memory that you allocate to it. Now, a lot of clients will simply say, well, more is better. So let's give it 15 CPUs and 75 gigs of RAM. And the problem there is, if you live in a virtual world, if you overcommit your resources, you actually can hurt performance. And by the way, if you give your SQL server more than 4 cores, then you get to pay Microsoft a little bit more in SQL licensing. Now, I've actually found that most SQL servers don't need more than 4 cores, but I've seen a lot of clients that just start throwing CPUs at it to try and make it go faster without doing the appropriate bottleneck or analysis for the bottleneck. And so then when Microsoft comes down and does the Microsoft audit, which some of you might have been the pleasure of receiving, they come down and look at your SQL licensing and go, well, you're running 8 cores, so that means you need 4 2-packs of SQL licenses, and it's a couple of grand. Enterprise licensing, now we're talking enterprise SQL licensing, now we're talking 5 figures, not just 4 figures. One of the big problems I see in a virtualized world is you're not using the appropriate drivers. For those folks that are in the VM world, this is something that when I do most of my P21 discovery calls where clients have deployed P21, they forgot to use the VMX Net3 network driver. This is an optimized driver in the VMware environment. If you're not using it, it's an easy swap. It is downtime. So make sure you have a maintenance window where you can swap out that NIC card in that virtual machine. Also goes true for any other driver that you've got in that world. But in the virtualized world, that VMX Net3 tends to be one of the top pain points that I see in the P21 space. Of course, when you're building your server, you want to follow the Epicor recommended sizing guides. And generally what I do is I start with that guide as a base, and then I tune from there. We have some clients that are small, and they don't need 24 gigs of RAM in their middleware server. And if most of that memory is going to waste, I would rather take it from a VM and give it over to another VM that could use it better. Maybe an RDP server. Definitely the SQL server could always use more RAM because that makes it go faster until your SQL server has enough RAM to cache your entire database. Some clients have very small databases. Other clients I've seen, P21 databases in the order of 200 or 300 gigs. That's kind of difficult to, kind of expensive to put into a single SQL server, and generally not recommended to put 300 gigs of RAM in a SQL server. So there's a key question there that when you hit that tipping point of performance, that is your users saying this isn't fast enough, do you go with scaling up the server or scaling out to more servers? Now, basically that means, scaling up is you add more RAM, you add more CPU, you add more disk to support the user base, and you try and keep all your users squeezed into one server where you don't have one operating system, one license, one thing to worry about. On the other hand, as we've seen in the legacy client, after you get about 15 users on an RDP server, Adding more RAM to that box doesn't help. Adding more CPUs doesn't help. You just have to add more servers, more RDP servers in that case. In the middleware environment, we've seen that one middleware server, Epicor, they're a little gray in their recommendations, but typically they say about 50 users on a middleware server, and then you need to scale out. So you're going to add more middleware servers and do this kind of load balancing cool trick to get those additional users into the same P21 space. Now, unfortunately, when we look at this server scaling and performance, one of the key things is to properly monitor it. You can't just turn on the server and just hope it's working properly. So you need the tools, whether it's performance monitor or third-party tools, to be able to watch that server and see, is it maxing out in one resource or another, to decide whether or not you're going to scale up or scale out. That monitoring is a critical part of any server environment. You can't just put it in place and hope it works. So I want to keep that in mind there as far as monitoring is concerned. Now, server security, certainly a big part. I didn't want to drop the ball on this because we've got our disaster recovery and testing of that disaster recovery. It's always great to cry fire and see who responds. And restore your servers. I have a lot of clients that say, yes, we do backups, but I've never had to restore from the backup. You should be able to restore your backups, preferably into the test environment, so you don't interrupt production, even from bare metal. Right? Microsoft does it to us on a regular basis. Feels like once a year they release a patch that torches the system. So you have to plan for the maintenance window to do the patch. You also have to plan for, what if the patch doesn't do what it's supposed to do? How do you fall back? What's your disaster recovery policy? One of the key things that I've noticed also in your security model is malware protection. You have antivirus. And if your antivirus is not SQL aware, IIS aware, and P21 aware, you might be scanning more than you need. I've seen lots of malware software, malware protection, pardon me, the antivirus tools. And they're scanning SQL databases looking for viruses, and they slow down SQL incredibly. So we want to make sure to do the appropriate exclusions for your antivirus. And there are a number of account best practices. I don't want to dive into the details here, but your P21 application runs with SQL accounts and with Windows accounts to be able to do the middleware stuff. And if you just practice the quote best practices, make sure that you have accounts lockouts turned on, for example. So if you have a hacker in your network, they're just not trying the SA password all day long until they win. You want to make sure that those accounts get locked out. That's both at the Windows level and the SQL level. We have those levels of protection. Don't use administrator. That should really go without saying at this point, because the administrator account, if you have one, the password should be really, really good. And if you change that password, you don't want P21 to break. Those service accounts that you do use, I would strongly recommend don't log in on a regular basis as those service accounts. Right? If you're trying to log in as the admin user on a regular basis and you fat finger the password and you lock the account, P21 might break. All of a sudden, emails don't go out because it can't authenticate as administrator or admin anymore. And there's a little known but great feature of Active Directory where you can restrict the locations of those accounts. So you can say this service account can only be logged in from the SQL server and from my middleware server, and that's it. So we're not going to have somebody on the edge of your network trying to log in as an application pool or some service account. So there's great tools that we have here to tighten the screws. Of course, the only problem with security is as you tighten the screws, you run the risk of breaking something. So that's why you tighten the screws and test first, and then you roll over to your production environment once you know what the impact is going to be. All right, so our server security then, we've got next moving on to our infrastructure management. All right, infrastructures, how are all these things connected? They could be connected most likely through Ethernet. Your legacy client talking to the SQL server should probably be an Ethernet. It might be a WAN, and if it's a WAN, that's great, but there are latencies that are introduced in the WAN environment. They could be coming in over VPN, and while that's fully supported, VPNs, you typically don't want to run the P21 legacy client on that VPN endpoint, talking over the VPN all the way back to the SQL server, because that's going to introduce a latency And unless it's a very forgiving and lightweight user, they're probably not going to be happy. And then there's road warriors, of course, where they're coming in probably over a VPN to be able to access the P21 environment. And we need to keep in mind here with road warriors, you might have users coming in over the public internet space and be able to access that over some protocol. Typically it's SSL. Keep in mind when you do an SSL certificate, which is now the way that we typically roll out the middleware server, SSL certs now have a maximum of a 1-year lifespan. Thank you very much, Google, for shortening it. We used to have 3-year certificates a couple of years ago. And now if you buy an SSL cert from a third-party CA, it's only a 1 year. So that means every year you're going back into your middleware server and you're swapping a certificate. Easy to do, but you got to remember it's there. Put a reminder on your calendar before the SSL expires, and everybody goes, wow, P21's down because of an expired SSL cert. Of course, your storage, whether that's direct attached storage or it's a SAN-based storage, how quickly that SQL server can get to the database is going to be key in your performance. And make sure that you look for those latencies in the connections, right? One of the things that we use in our hosted environment is the remote desktop protocol over UDP instead of TCP. Now, typically that's only used in the legacy client environment, but that's one way that you can help improve the performance. If you use the web or the hybrid client, it's naturally a thinner or lighter on the network client than the legacy client. So if you're using the web or the hybrid client, you probably aren't going to need RDP servers. You're probably going to be able to spread that the network out. Road warriors can probably use the web client even over a VPN without having to suffer the consequences of that legacy client and its high-speed connections needed to the SQL server. We've also found that there's a number of clients that use different types of connections to the SQL server. Even if you're in the web/hybrid client world, we have clients that connect up to the SQL server for ODBC connections, right? Excel spreadsheets, reporting tools, all these things, they go right to the P21 database. And don't forget about them, because while the web client is great, if that Excel spreadsheet doesn't get updated data, users aren't going to be happy. And that typically is done through some network protocol. Again, there's a variety of different ways to do it. But in the typical world, that's going to be the client talking directly to the SQL server. Okay, moving on. Still no questions? That's great. I'm going to save a couple of minutes here at the end, and I know I am. A few more slides here to go. Okay, applications. I'm not going to dive into the details of SQL servers. If you're a SQL DBA, you probably know all of this. If you're not a SQL DBA, I would strongly recommend that you get your hands on one. So that they can take a look at, we have DBAs on staff here at EstesGroup, where you can say, hey, let's look at how the memory is allocated in your SQL server. What's the transaction log looks like? Are you doing backups properly? If you've never restored from your backup, then you probably don't have a backup. Sure, you might get the email every night that says the backup was done, but until you test it, ideally from the ground up, right? Not just the database, but the whole SQL server, the whole middleware server. Backups are a really important thing to test, and that's true of SQL as well as all of the different servers. I list off a couple of different websites here. These are folks that we use in our hosting environment to make sure that our SQL servers are running properly. Brent Ozar has a really great document. If you've Google out, not right now, I want you to pay attention to me, but when you get a spare time, Google 9 ways to lose your SQL data. And you'll find a blog article by Brent, which is a really scary article. It talks about 9 different ways that a well-meaning sysadmin, DB admin, can accidentally lose your SQL database. And believe it or not, in my tenure here as a DBA, I have seen all 9 ways, and none of them are pretty. So please make sure that you have that moment. So therefore, index optimization is a big part, making sure that your P21 SQL indexes are optimized. I see P21 databases have been running for years. They just get slower and slower and slower. And that's because their indexes were never re-indexed. Easy fix. Ola Hollengren's written a great script to do that. And of course, monitoring it. One tool is Quest has a great SQL Spotlight tool. And there are others out there to just watch the SQL server and make sure it's not blowing up. With your IIS server, you want to make sure that if you're keeping your IIS logs, that's the historical logs. Typically in a web server world, we look at those logs to see who's visiting my website, where did they come from, and where are they clicking to. In the P21 space, those log files typically are not used. So either turn them off, or if you're using them, manage them, as in don't fill up your disk with a bunch of little log files. Very often I can go into a middleware server or an IIS server, and if they don't do log file management, I can see from day one that the server was stood up to today, one file per day, that the server's been alive. And that's great, except it fills up disk space. And if you're not using log, disable it. There are a couple of tools also that we keep in the application server, middleware server, to recycle the app pool. And this is actually included in one of these P21 tuning guides. I did include the KB articles. Some are a little old, I get that, but these KB articles we use when we install P21 to make sure it's optimized, so that we have the best experience for those users. And that has to do with IIS tuning, SQL tuning, and the application of the middleware tuning as well. Okay, so change management, a huge issue here. I want to make sure that you have a change management system. Because if you don't have a change management system and you just are making, by the seat of your pants changes to the ERP system, then all of a sudden something breaks, or it gets slow, or it feels different, or something like that, and you go across the finger pointing exercise. Who did that? When did you do it? Why did you do that? What did it impact? And so making sure that you can identify those changes is going to be key, and the dates that those changes occurred. So when you create changes, or when you make a change, it creates both the intended effect. Our server's patched. We upgraded P21, right? Our antivirus tool is now doing a better job at being antivirus. But it also has unintended fallout, right? It's slower now. Now, maybe slower is because the new tool or the new feature you rolled out does indeed need more resources, and it's just slower because the nature of the beast. But on the other hand, it could be unintended, right? I didn't realize that we're now scanning the SQL databases for malware again. So be ready for those changes. It could be as simple as an Excel sheet. I personally love OneNote. OneNote is a great tool to do change management because you can screenshot the before and you can screenshot the after in one note, no pun intended. And that way, and it's all timestamped, so that way you can track it down, you can find it. So OneNote is a great tool. There are change management systems. If you're a larger company, you've already got change management tools in place for things other than P21. Just make sure P21 falls in that change management infrastructure. Of course, you need to be able to test your changes. Whenever you make a change, ideally you do the whole quote to cache, A to Z testing to make sure that what you changed didn't break something. And that would be great if we just had unlimited time in the day to start doing testing. You might have dedicated testers in your environment, right? When you upgrade P21, you typically upgrade the test environment first. And then, as a server guy, after I do the upgrade, I bring up the P21 client and I log in and I get to the homepage and I go, I'm good, right? The upgrade worked. From an infrastructure standpoint, yes, right? If I can log in and the client was upgraded, perfect. But from a functional standpoint, does that new P21 version do what you need it to do? And we have a bunch of functional folks. Again, we're going to let Terry and Jim talk more about that aspect later, because the new versions of P21, especially when you jump from legacy to web client, it's a different animal. And so being able to test those changes, identify any issues. Oh yeah, we need to train the end users. I'm going to talk about training in this deck, but make sure that you can test that out. And that includes not just the P21 application, but all the ancillary tools that are around it. Because when you do that upgrade, first off, you got to have your patch management window, right? Tell all your users, the first Sunday of the month is patch day. Microsoft for the long time, right? It was the second Tuesday of the month was Patch Tuesday. And they would create all sorts of problems on the following Wednesday because everybody would install Microsoft patches and then stuff would break. And if you don't test it first and you just do it direct in production, that might be a bad day. So you need a fallback plan. So be ready because those patches are coming. The Windows operating system gets updated. Even Server 19 has updates and patches. SQL gets updated. SQL 2019, they don't do service packs anymore for SQL. They just do cumulative updates. So much like the Windows cadence now, SQL just gets little patches every month or so. And they recommend you install them. But if you don't have enough bandwidth, you're just trying to get your day job done. Installing all these patches might fall by the wayside. Of course, the Epicor application itself. We know several clients that are sitting there in an old version of P21 simply because they don't have the bandwidth to do the testing, or they found a bug and they don't have the fixes for those bugs just yet. Epicor is classic for saying, oh, we fixed that in the next version. So just upgrade again and we'll get that fixed up. Not to mention the third-party applications, your e-commerce connectivity, your ODBC drivers, your third-party reporting tools, all those things that are using the P21 infrastructure to do their job. And you do an update to P21 and it might be a surprise, the website broke. That would be bad. So when it looks to doing these changes, I'd like to identify some of the responsibilities that your IT folks have right now in managing your P21 space. So I kind of layered this out here in a couple of different ways because I wanted to bring to the table here. We've got from the very bottom of this chart all the way up to the top. We look at this from what IT layers are your IT folks responsible for. At the bottom level, we have our networking. That's the Ethernet and the VPN. If you have a SAN, that's your SAN uses a network also. Then we have our storage, which is your disks, how fast those disks spin, how many disks, are they RAID 1, RAID 5? We have on top of that, most of the time now we have some layer of virtualization. So we have a virtualization layer, Hyper-V or VMware. On top of that virtualization layer, we build servers, right? Here's a box, we're gonna call it SQL. It's gonna have 4 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, and that's a server. And on top of that server, we put an operating system. Might be Windows 16, Windows 19. I would recommend you don't install Windows 12 anymore, 2012 anymore, Server 2012, that's old. Even Server 2016 is getting a little long in the tooth. If you have the option, go Server 19 and future-proof yourself. On top of that operating system, you install middleware. That's going to be SQL, IIS, P21 middleware. On top of that, you plop data, right? You've got your P21 database. So your SQL DB admins need to know how to move data around. On top of that, you put an application, let's call it P21. And the way you roll out P21 is maybe you decide to roll out the web client for your users. Maybe you decide to roll out the legacy client for some set of folks because they're old school and they don't like change. And then you roll out the web client for all your new hires. And then ultimately, this thing called seats is where we take the application and you package it in such a way to where the user just consumes the data. They're not responsible for managing the application, or they're not responsible for changing how the application works, or adding new tax codes and adding new warehousing locations and things like that. Where you're managing kind of the application, the data layer. They're just users. They just need a seat, right? And so when we look at these different layers, as we roll across from your on-prem environment all the way through the cloud services, it's important to kind of note here that on-premise, you're managing it all. Now, EstesGroup as a managed service provider can certainly help, but as we move into the cloud environment, you might choose to be infrastructure as a service. That is, I want to have all of the machines and the virtualization and all that networking stuff just taken care of for me. Azure and Amazon Web Services is a classic solution for that. Then there's platform as a service, where more and more of that functionality all the way up to that through the application layer is taken care of by the cloud provider. Okay, and all you need to do is manage how are you going to roll this out to your user, what protocols do you choose, and then if you go all the way to software as a service, this is where basically you go, I need a P21 solution, please, and just give it to me in a web browser. I'm done. And so that becomes a very sanitized version of P21, where you don't have a lot of flexibility, but you get a lot of scalability. Every one of you has probably been approached by Epicor by now that says, hey, we have P21 SaaS as a service, software as a service, and that's the P21 SaaS environment. And if you fit in that, great. But there's a lot of clients that don't have the, they can't fit in that box for any number of reasons. And so that's when they'd start looking at private cloud environments or hybrid cloud environments like EstesGroup can provide, where we can give you the flexibility without forcing you into a small box. Okay, next slide here was just talking about those application layers. I've already described all of this to you already, so I'm not going to read the slide. Whether you're delivering the application in a fixed format, whether you get to deliver the application and say, hey, you get to pick the web client or the hybrid client or the legacy client, your SQL database manager, right? You need to be able to copy live to play, usually on a regular basis, we do that. You might also have to move your SQL data in and out of the database, e-commerce application, for example. Managing the middleware servers, right? Whether it's SQL, it's IIS, or it's the P21 application on top of those. That's a lot of middleware. You have to manage the Windows operating system, right? P21 is a Windows OS solution. The clients can be Mac, clients can be Linux machines with the browser. The servers themselves, you've got to allocate the right amount of CPU and resources. The virtualization layer can be a huge bottleneck if you're not careful. The storage, likewise, if you don't have fast enough storage, everything suffers, especially to that SQL server. And then the networking aspect, right? You need to get all the networking geeks together to make sure that they're all connected, not only that they're talking, but they're talking securely, because that's where the bad guys break in. Okay, we have a number of different hosting options. You can take your ERP system and put it on an on-premise server, right? You're probably coming from that environment now where you bought a SQL server and maybe some terminal servers and you installed the P21 client. That's great. You can still do that. They can be physical or virtual, and it's a capital expense. You're buying a server. When you buy a server, you're going to expect to depreciate that over 5 years, roughly. And so you're going to overbuy that server. You're going to buy a bigger box than you need right today because you've got to plan for future growth. Then you can put it up in the public cloud. That's another place where you can rent the resource from an Amazon or Azure infrastructure as a service in that previous slide. And it turns into a monthly rental, but there's pros and cons. We'll talk about that in the next feature. You can, of course, go with Epicor, right, and get Epicor SaaS for P21, and that's great, and it turns into an operational expense where you manage very little. You just get seats. Then you can also go with a private managed cloud environment like our EstesCloud managed hosting, which no surprise I'm a big fan of. And this is where basically we can put you in a shared tenant to save some costs. We can put you in a dedicated tenant if you are, if you sell to the government. You're DFARS, ITAR, CNMC compliant, and that would be a dedicated tenant because they don't play well with others. Again, it does turn into an operational expense. The nice thing about our Echo environment is that we can scale up and down fairly easily. So if your Christmas rush means that you need some more CPUs and some more servers to handle the crunch of Christmas, great, we can spin it up over the Christmas holiday. And then in January, when it settles back down, we can take out CPUs, we can take out memory, save yourself a couple of bucks. So on premise, of course, you've got to buy the servers and maintain them and support them and replace all the hard drives when they die, because hard drives still die. You need to make sure that you don't lose a system because 2 hard drives died in a RAID system. If you host it in the public cloud, you are completely dependent upon the vendor response. I don't know if any of you had to call Amazon or Microsoft lately because of an issue. That might not be the greatest experience, especially when your ERP system is down. You want to be able to pick up the phone and yell at somebody. So putting in the public cloud, they kind of remove that phone call ability. Microsoft doesn't let you call them anymore. You can still open a ticket and somebody will get back to you, but it's not the same warm fuzzy as picking up the phone and going, fix it. SaaS, of course, is great when you want free and forced upgrades. And that's helpful to some users where they don't have a complex environment and it's okay to get an upgrade. And then 2 weeks later, you upgrade your production environment. But SaaS forces you to get that update. Understandably, Epicor's got to keep their code base current. They don't want to keep supporting your legacy environment from 3 years ago because you just never updated. But y'all have heard from your Epicor cam already on why you haven't updated, right? Or been asked why. And then, of course, in the private cloud environment, where we can maintain the servers and the application and the infrastructure and the databases and all that stuff, and give you flexibility as to how you're going to connect things, what add-ons you want to put into that P21 environment, what your upgrade and update schedule needs to be, right? You can say, let's update the test environment this weekend, give us a month to test it, and then we'll put it into production. And then, of course, the disaster recovery and the backups, we make sure that your server is being backed up and that we can restore it in the appropriate RPO and RTOs that you need. So lots of benefits here. And I would encourage you to take a look at each of these different places that you can put your ERP system. We'd be happy to share with you any more details about our Echo environment. But I didn't want to pitch that too much because I'm out of my time. So I want to make sure that I opened the slide up for any questions and the presentation up for any questions. Again, if you have any more, I will be available after the presenters at our little roundtable discussion in a couple hours from now. But for that, I do appreciate your attention. If you have any questions, I'm watching this screen over here to see what they might be. And with that, I say thank you very much for your time. I look forward to answering questions.
And Daryl,
with that, Cindy, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Awesome, thank you. I have a couple of questions for you that came into me, if you would be so kind as to answer them.
Absolutely.
And you might have answered this during, but I'm not super technical, so just tell me to pass if so. Do
Absolutely.
I need to be on the latest version of P21 to use the hybrid or web client?
So do you have to be on the latest version of P21 to use the web or hybrid client? The answer is no, but Epicor prefers that you are, right? We have seen market improvements, not only in feature sets, but in performance and I want to say bug fixes to the later versions. So if you're running the hybrid client or the web client and it's not exactly what you expected, my recommendation would be to update to the latest version and see if that fixes your problem. But actually the web client's been out for 3 or 4 years now. So it's not a new product. Okay.
All right, another one. Okay, 2 came in. So for customers familiar with E10 but new to Prophet 21, are there any issues you should watch out for at the database level? Any significant database differences between Prophet 21 and E10?
So in terms of the database structure, yes, there are absolute differences. The ERP10 product uses a database and a lot of ancillary databases, where P21 primarily has one database per application. So P21 is a little simpler of an environment and doesn't have as many interactions between databases as E10 does. But the concepts and management, what I've discussed here, really is applicable to almost any ERP system. You still need to monitor your servers and make sure that they're properly tuned, not over or under committed in memory. So the answer to that, I'd have to say, no, there's not any issues that I would look out for. There's just different facets to the application and how they operate. So hopefully that answers the question.
Please review, if you could, what the VMX NET3 driver is for.
Awesome. Right. So the VMX Net3 driver is a VMware specific network card driver. A lot of clients, when they install a new virtual server in the VMware world, they install the Windows operating system, and the Windows operating system goes, well, how much CPU, memory, disk, and network do I have? And can I auto detect my drivers? And so the client will, the server will install with what's called an emulated driver. It's typically an Intel E1000 NIC, which works. Don't get me wrong. And if it works, then the engineer typically goes, hey, great, I got an IP address, I'm good. And they move forward. But they forget to install the VMware tools, which is a little helper application, very, very important in the VMware environment. Microsoft started building this in the Hyper-V environment many years ago. So Hyper-V folks don't see this issue. But in the VMware environment, if you don't take that Intel E1000 NIC and remove it and install the native VMware VMX Net3 NIC, you're missing out on network performance. And if that network performance happens to be on your SQL server to the middleware server, both of those should have VMX Net3 drivers to be able to talk really fast. Otherwise, they go down to a emulated Intel E1000 NIC, and it works, it's just not optimal. And I see that very frequently. All right, anything else?
I believe that that covers it, and we're out of time. I had a few more come in, but I'm going to pocket those for the roundtable. So if that's okay, I'd like if we could share the results of the poll. I don't believe those were shared the first time. If somebody could pull that up, please.
How's this?
All right, thank you very much. So yeah, just so we have that, I know someone requested at the end that we discuss that. So how have you deployed Prophet 21 at your organization? 30% of you web client, 40% hybrid, 50% legacy SAT client. So there you have it. Thank you again, Daryl.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.